The day my stepdaughter demanded a DNA test to prove I wasn't her real family. She'd spent years making it clear she didn't accept me as her father's wife, and now she wanted scientific proof that we weren't blood-related. I agreed to take the test just to put the matter to rest. But when those results came back, they revealed a secret that had been buried for over 40 years, a secret that changed everything we thought we knew about our family. Sometimes the truth isn't what sets you free. Sometimes it's what destroys everything you believed in. Before I tell you about that DNA test and what it revealed, I need to tell you about my relationship with my stepdaughter Claire, because understanding our complicated history is essential to understanding why she demanded that test and what the results truly meant. I met Claire's father, Richard, when I was 42 years old. I'd been widowed for 3 years after my husband Henry died of a heart attack, leaving me alone to navigate middle age and wondering if I'd ever find love again. Richard was 50, handsome and charming, a successful architect who'd been divorced for 15 years. We met at a community fundraiser where I was volunteering as a nurse. Richard had designed the new community center pro bono, and we struck up a conversation about giving back to the community. He asked me to dinner that same week, and honey, I felt something I hadn't felt since Henry died, hope for the future. Richard and I dated for a year before he proposed. During that time, he told me about his daughter Claire. She was 25, working as a marketing executive in New York City. Richard said she was brilliant and driven, but that their relationship was complicated. His ex-wife Monica had poisoned Claire against him during the divorce, he explained, and Claire had spent years believing her father had abandoned them when the truth was more complicated. I met Claire for the first time 2 months before Richard and I got married. She flew in from New York for a weekend, and from the moment she walked through Richard's door, I could feel the hostility radiating off her. Claire was beautiful in that polished, expensive way that comes from growing up with money and knowing how to present yourself. She looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain, and I could practically hear her thoughts. This is who my father is replacing my mother with? A middle-aged nurse from nowhere? That first dinner was excruciating. Claire directed all her conversation to her father, pointedly ignoring me except when she'd make comments clearly designed to remind me I was an outsider. She'd reference family memories I wasn't part of, inside jokes I didn't understand, traditions I hadn't been included in. She'd say things like, "Remember when Mom made that incredible roast at the beach house? You always said it was the best meal you'd ever had." Richard tried to include me in the conversation, but Claire would talk over me or change the subject whenever I spoke. By the end of the evening, I had a pounding headache and was questioning whether I could really marry into this family dynamic. I talked to Richard about it that night. He apologized for Claire's behavior and said she was still processing the news of our engagement. He promised she'd come around once she got to know me, once she saw how happy we made each other. But Claire never came around. Not at our wedding, where she gave a toast that was technically appropriate but delivered with such coldness it made several guests uncomfortable. Not at family gatherings, where she'd spend the entire time on her phone or finding excuses to leave early. Not at holidays, where she'd make pointed comments about how her mother spent holidays alone now because her father had moved on so easily. For the first 5 years of my marriage to Richard, Claire treated me like an interloper, someone who'd stolen her father and needed to be reminded at every opportunity that I'd never be part of the real family. She'd call Richard but ask him not to mention things to me, saying they were family business. She'd send him gifts for Father's Day and his birthday, but nothing for me. Not even a card on my birthday, despite Richard making it clear we were a package deal. I tried everything to build a bridge to Claire. I sent her thoughtful gifts for her birthday and holidays. I wrote her cards telling her I wasn't trying to replace her mother but hoped we could have our own relationship. I invited her to visit, offered to come to New York to take her to lunch, suggested we do activities together when she was in town. Claire rejected every overture. She'd thank me stiffly for gifts and then never mention them again. She'd ignore my cards or send back brief, impersonal responses. She'd decline invitations or accept and then cancel at the last minute. Richard would get frustrated with Claire's behavior and try to talk to her about it, but she'd just say she was polite to me and didn't understand what more he expected. She'd point out that she never said anything rude directly to me, never caused scenes, never did anything that could be called inappropriate. She was just keeping her distance, maintaining boundaries with someone who wasn't actually her family. And honey, she was right in a technical sense. She never openly insulted me or created drama. But the constant cold shoulder, the deliberate exclusion, the reminders that I wasn't really family, they were death by 1,000 cuts. The worst part was watching Richard caught in the middle. He loved his daughter and wanted a relationship with her, but he also loved me and hated seeing me hurt by Claire's rejection. He'd try to defend me to Claire, and she'd pull away from him. He'd try to explain Claire's perspective to me, and I'd feel like he was making excuses for her cruelty. Things escalated when Richard's mother died 6 years into our marriage. Richard's mother had always been kind to me, and I'd loved her as I would my own mother. When she passed away after a long illness, I was devastated. At the funeral, Claire barely acknowledged me. When people offered condolences to the family, she'd stand between Richard and me, physically blocking me out of the receiving line. When it came time to divide her grandmother's belongings, Claire insisted that only blood family should have input into what was kept and what was given away. Richard finally lost his temper with Claire. He told her that I was his wife, that I'd cared for his mother in her final months, that I'd earned the right to be treated as family. Claire said he could decree whatever he wanted, but blood was blood, and I wasn't actually related to any of them. That's when the comments about biology started. Claire would make pointed remarks about how I wasn't her real stepmother, that technically I was just her father's second wife. She'd talk about genetics and heredity and how family traits were passed down through blood. She'd make comments about how she looked like her grandmother and had her mother's personality and her father's intelligence, all biological connections that emphasized I was genetically separate from the family lineage. It felt like Claire was building a case for something, though I couldn't figure out what. The emphasis on biology and blood relations seemed to be going somewhere, but I didn't know where. Then came Thanksgiving 2 years ago. Claire had agreed to come home for the holiday, though she'd made it clear she was doing it for her father, not for me. I spent days preparing Richard's favorite dishes, decorating the house, trying to make everything perfect so Claire couldn't find anything to criticize. Dinner started out tense but civil. Then Claire brought up the topic of family heritage. She said she'd been doing research into the family tree, tracing back generations on both her mother's and father's sides. She talked about interesting ancestors she'd discovered, genetic traits that had been passed down through the generations. Then she turned to me and said, "Of course, none of that is actually relevant to you, since you're not biologically related to any of us. You can't trace your lineage through our family tree." Richard put down his fork and said firmly, "Claire, that's enough. Loretta is my wife and your stepmother. She's part of this family whether you're comfortable with that or not." Claire smiled that cold smile I'd come to know so well. "I'm just stating facts, Dad. She's not blood related to us. That's not an insult, it's just biology." I'd had enough. I told Claire that family was about more than biology, that love and commitment and choosing to be there for each other mattered more than genetics. I said I'd been there for her father through thick and thin, that I'd cared for his mother when she was dying, that I'd welcomed Claire into my home despite her constant rejection. Claire looked at me and said, "But you're still not really family, are you? Not in the way that actually matters. You could leave tomorrow and there'd be no biological connection between us at all. You'd just be someone my father used to be married to." The words hit me like a physical blow. Richard was furious, telling Claire she owed me an apology. Claire said she'd simply stated the truth, and if I was upset by facts, that was my problem. The rest of Thanksgiving was a disaster. Claire left early. Richard and I fought about whether he was doing enough to defend me. I cried myself to sleep that night, feeling like no matter what I did, I'd never be accepted by Claire. After that Thanksgiving, things were strained between Richard and Claire for months. She didn't visit for Christmas. She barely called. Richard was heartbroken, caught between his daughter and his wife. Then, in March of this year, Claire called and asked if she could come visit. She said she wanted to talk to both of us about something important. Richard was hopeful that she was finally ready to apologize and move forward. Claire arrived on a Saturday afternoon. She seemed different, less hostile, but also more determined, like she was there on a mission. We sat in the living room, and Claire said she'd been doing a lot of thinking about family and relationships and what it all meant. Then she dropped the bomb. She said she wanted to do a DNA test, her, Richard, and me. She said it would settle things once and for all about family and who was related to whom. I was confused. I asked her what exactly she thought a DNA test would settle. Obviously, Richard and I weren't related, and obviously Claire and I weren't related. What was the point of confirming what we already knew? Claire said she wanted it documented, wanted scientific proof of the biological relationships in the family. She said too many assumptions had been made, too many things taken on faith. She wanted facts. Richard asked her why this mattered so much to her. Claire said that understanding biological relationships was important to her, especially as she thought about her own future family. She said she wanted to know her genetic heritage with certainty. Something about the way she said it made me suspicious. This wasn't just about confirming that I wasn't biologically related to them. Claire was looking for something specific, though I couldn't figure out what. Richard was reluctant, saying it seemed unnecessary and potentially hurtful, but Claire pressed, saying if he refused, it would look like he was hiding something. She said if everyone was who they said they were, a DNA test would just confirm that and they could all move forward. I surprised everyone, including myself, by agreeing to the test. I told Claire that if she needed scientific proof that I wasn't trying to claim biological relationship to her family, fine. We'd do the test, confirm what we all already knew, and then maybe she could move past her obsession with blood relation and accept that family was about more than genetics. Claire looked relieved, almost excited. We ordered DNA test kits that would compare all three of us. Claire said she wanted a reputable lab that did paternity and familial relationship testing, not just the ancestry tests you see advertised on TV. The test itself was simple, just cheek swabs that we sent to the lab. Claire paid the rush fee to get results back within 2 weeks, rather than the standard 4 to 6 weeks. She seemed anxious to get the results, checking her email constantly, calling the lab to confirm they'd received the samples. I asked Richard if he had any idea what Claire was really looking for with this test. He admitted he didn't understand her motivations, but thought maybe once she had scientific confirmation of the family relationships, she'd finally feel secure enough to stop pushing me away. The results came back on a Tuesday. Claire called that evening and asked if she could come over the next day to discuss the findings with us. She sounded strange on the phone, not triumphant or vindicated, but shaken, almost scared. When Claire arrived Wednesday evening, she looked like she hadn't slept. She sat down with a manila envelope containing the DNA test results and asked us to let her explain some things before we looked at them. She said that several months ago, she'd overheard a conversation between her mother, Monica, and Monica's sister. They'd been drinking wine, talking about the past, and they'd said things they clearly didn't know Claire could hear. Claire heard her aunt say something about the real story of Claire's birth. She heard her mother respond that some secrets were better left buried, that Claire didn't need to know everything. Claire confronted her mother, demanding to know what secrets she was talking about. Monica brushed it off, said they'd just been gossiping about old times, that it was nothing important. But Claire couldn't let it go. The comment about the real story of her birth haunted her. She started going through her mother's belongings when Monica was out, looking for anything that might explain what her aunt had meant. She found a box hidden in the back of Monica's closet. Inside were letters, old photographs, and medical records. The medical records showed that Monica had struggled with infertility for years before Claire was born. There were records of failed fertility treatments, discussions of adoption, mentions of alternative arrangements. Claire found a letter from a lawyer discussing something about parental rights and biological parents and sealed records. There was a photograph of Monica pregnant, but she was wearing a shirt that said baby due June 1989, except Claire had been born in March 1989. Claire realized that her mother's story about her birth might not be accurate. She started wondering if she'd been adopted or if there was some other explanation for her existence that her parents had hidden from her. She'd thought about confronting Richard and demanding answers, but she'd decided to gather evidence first. That's why she'd pushed for the DNA test. She'd wanted to confirm whether Richard was actually her biological father. Now she opened the envelope and showed us the results. She was visibly shaking. The test confirmed that Claire was Richard's biological daughter, but it also showed something unexpected, something that made no sense given what we all thought we knew about our family. The test showed that I was Claire's biological mother. The three of us sat in stunned silence, staring at those results. It was impossible. I'd never had a child. I'd struggled with infertility for years with Henry, had never gotten pregnant. I'd certainly never had a baby I'd given up. And Claire was 25 years old, which meant she'd been born when I was 17. At 17, I'd been a high school student living with my parents. I'd never been pregnant. I'd never had a baby. This had to be a mistake. But Claire pulled out her birth certificate. She'd been born the 15th of March, 1989. I counted back 9 months in my head and realized that meant she'd been conceived in June 1988. June 1988. Honey, that's when my world stopped making sense. In June 1988, I'd been 16 years old, about to start my senior year of high school. I'd been dating a boy named David, who was a year older, already graduated. We'd been serious, or as serious as teenagers get. We'd talked about getting married after I graduated. Then, in early June, David had died in a car accident. I'd been devastated, completely shattered by losing him. I'd spent most of that summer in a fog of grief, barely eating or sleeping, just existing in this haze of pain. My parents had been worried about me. I remembered them talking to doctors, remembered being put on medication, remembered my mother watching me constantly like she was afraid I'd do something to hurt myself. Then, in September, my mother had told me we were going on an extended trip to visit family. We'd gone to stay with my mother's sister in another state. I'd missed the first 2 months of my senior year. My mother said I needed time away from home to heal from David's death, time in a new place where I wouldn't be reminded of him constantly. We'd stayed with my aunt until December, then we'd come home, and I'd return to school after Christmas break. Everyone had accepted my mother's explanation that I'd needed time away after David's death. My teachers had let me make up the work I'd missed. But as I sat there looking at those DNA results, a different explanation for that missing time was forming in my mind, an explanation so horrible I didn't want to believe it. I asked Claire if I could see her medical records from the box she'd found. She handed them over. I read through documents about Monica's infertility treatments, about her desperation to have a child, about how she'd been willing to consider any option to become a mother. Then I found a letter between Monica and a lawyer discussing a private adoption arrangement and a young birth mother who wishes to remain anonymous. My hands were shaking as I looked at Richard. I asked him when exactly he and Monica had gotten divorced. He said they'd divorced when Claire was 10 in 1999, but that their marriage had been troubled for years before that. I asked him when they'd gotten married. He said 1988 in May. May 1988, 1 month before David died, 1 month before I would have gotten pregnant if Claire really was my biological daughter. I felt like I was going to be sick. I asked Richard if Monica had been pregnant when they got married. He said no, that they'd been trying to have a baby but Monica couldn't get pregnant. Then suddenly, around September or October, Monica had told him she was pregnant. They'd been thrilled. I counted the months in my head. Monica announced her pregnancy in September or October 1988. Claire was born in March 1989. That was only 5 or 6 months, not enough time for a full-term pregnancy, unless Monica had lied about when she got pregnant. Or unless Monica had never been pregnant at all. I asked Richard if he'd been with Monica during her pregnancy, if he'd gone to doctor appointments with her. He said no, that he'd been traveling a lot for work during that time, establishing his architecture firm. Monica had handled the pregnancy herself, using a doctor she'd chosen who didn't take his insurance anyway. She'd said she preferred it that way, that she wanted to handle the woman stuff without him hovering. He'd only come back for the birth. Monica had told him she'd gone into labor early, that she'd delivered at a small hospital outside the city, that everything had happened so fast. By the time he'd gotten there, Claire had already been born. I asked to see Claire's birth certificate again. It listed Monica as the mother and Richard as the father. The hospital was one I'd never heard of, in a small town 2 hours away. Claire was looking between us, clearly trying to process what all this meant. She asked the question I'd been afraid to voice. Are you saying my mother pretended to be pregnant with me, but actually, you're saying I was yours? That you gave me up for adoption? I told her I didn't remember being pregnant. I didn't remember giving birth. I didn't remember anything about having a baby or giving a baby away. But the DNA test didn't lie. Claire was biologically Richard's daughter and mine. Which meant somehow, impossibly, I'd gotten pregnant at 16, had given birth, and had no memory of any of it. I called my mother that night. She was 78 now, living in a retirement community in Florida. I asked her point blank if I'd been pregnant in 1988, if I'd had a baby, if that was the real reason we'd gone to stay with her sister. There was a long silence on the phone. Then my mother started crying. She said she'd hoped I'd never find out, that they'd thought they were protecting me by keeping it secret. She told me what had really happened that terrible summer. After David died, I'd sunk into such a deep depression that I'd been barely functional. Then in late July, my mother had noticed I'd stopped getting my period. She'd insisted I take a pregnancy test. It had been positive. My mother said I'd completely fallen apart when I found out. I was 16, grieving the death of my boyfriend and pregnant with his baby. I'd talked about killing myself, about not being able to face what was happening. My parents had made the decision to handle it quietly. They'd taken me to my aunt's house, told everyone I was taking time to grieve. They'd kept me isolated, not letting me contact friends, controlling what information I had access to. My mother said I'd been severely depressed throughout the pregnancy, barely present mentally. I'd refused to talk about the baby, refused to make plans, just existed in this fog of grief and denial. When I'd gone into labor, my parents had taken me to a small private hospital they'd arranged. I'd given birth to a baby girl. My mother said I'd held the baby once, looked at her face, and then turned away and asked them to take her. My parents had arranged a private adoption through a lawyer who specialized in such things. The adoptive parents had been a young married couple desperate for a child. The adoption had been closed, no contact, no information shared, sealed records. After the birth, my mother said I'd had a breakdown. I'd been hospitalized for a few weeks, treated for postpartum depression and grief and trauma. When I'd come out, my memories of the pregnancy and birth were fractured and unclear. My parents had decided it was better not to talk about it, to let me move forward without the burden of remembering. They brought me home in December. I'd gone back to school. I'd rebuilt my life. Over time, I'd either blocked out the memories, or they'd become so fragmented I couldn't access them anymore. My mother swore they'd thought they were helping me. They'd thought that by letting me forget, by not forcing me to confront what had happened, they were giving me a chance at a normal life. And in a way, They had. I'd gone to college. I'd become a nurse. I'd married Henry. I'd built a good life. I'd never had the trauma of remembering that I'd been pregnant at 16 and given away my baby. But now, 25 years later, that baby was sitting in my living room, looking at me with confusion and hurt, and I had to face what I'd been protected from remembering. Over the next several days, the full story came together. My mother put me in touch with the lawyer who'd handled the adoption. He was retired now, but still had records. He confirmed that he'd arranged a private adoption for a baby girl born to me in March 1989, placed with Richard and Monica. Richard was devastated. He'd had no idea that Monica had lied to him about being pregnant, that Claire wasn't biologically Monica's daughter. He'd never questioned it, never had reason to doubt that Monica had given birth to Claire. He contacted Monica, demanding the truth. Monica admitted everything. She'd been desperate for a baby, desperate to save her marriage, which was already struggling. When she'd learned through the lawyer about a pregnant teenager giving up her baby, she'd seen an opportunity. She'd pretended to be pregnant, carefully timing the announcement of her pregnancy to match when she'd be bringing home the adopted baby. She told Richard she preferred to handle the pregnancy herself, which gave her cover for not having him at doctor appointments or seeing her pregnant body regularly. She'd gone into labor at a time when Richard was traveling, then brought home the adopted baby and claimed she'd given birth. Richard, trusting his wife and overwhelmed with becoming a father, hadn't questioned the details. Monica had never intended for the truth to come out. She'd thought the adoption records were sealed forever, that I would never remember or come looking. She'd convinced herself that by raising Claire as her biological daughter, she was giving Claire the best life possible. She'd forgotten one crucial detail. Richard was actually Claire's biological father. Because David, my boyfriend who died in 1988, had been Richard's nephew. David's mother had been Richard's sister. I'd known David's last name was Morrison. I'd never made the connection to Richard Morrison because it was a common name, and Richard's sister had married someone with a different last name. I'd never met David's extended family. We'd only dated for 6 months before he died. But the DNA test had revealed the truth. Richard and David had been related, which meant when Monica adopted my baby with David, she was actually adopting her husband's biological niece without knowing it. Claire was the product of a relationship between Richard's nephew and a grieving teenager. Monica had adopted her, lied about giving birth to her, and raised her as if she were Monica's biological daughter. And through a bizarre twist of fate, Claire actually was biologically Richard's family, just not in the way anyone thought. The revelation shattered everyone involved. Claire had to process that her entire identity had been a lie, that her mother had deceived her and Richard for 25 years, that the woman she'd been so cruel to was actually her biological mother. Richard had to process that his wife had lied to him about one of the most fundamental things in their marriage, that he'd been raising his own niece without knowing it, that the young woman he'd just married had unknowingly been carrying his family's genetic legacy. And I had to process that I'd had a child at 16, that I'd given her away, that I'd spent 25 years not remembering her existence, and that through the cruelest twist of fate, I'd married into the family that had adopted her. Claire moved out of the house she'd been sharing with roommates and spent 2 weeks at our house, trying to understand her own history. We talked for hours, her asking questions about David and about what I could remember of that time. I told her about David, how sweet he'd been, how young we both were, how his death had shattered me. I told her that in a strange way, she was the last piece of him, the final legacy of a boy who died too young. I showed her photos of David that my mother had kept. Claire studied them, seeing her own features reflected in his face. She had his nose, his smile, his thick dark hair. Looking at those photos was bittersweet, seeing the boy I'd loved in the face of the daughter I'd unknowingly given away. Richard and I talked about what this meant for our marriage. We'd married each other not knowing we shared a biological daughter, not knowing that decades earlier our lives had intersected in this profound way. It felt like fate or destiny or some cosmic joke that we'd found each other not knowing we were already connected through Claire. Slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild relationships based on truth rather than assumptions. Claire apologized for years of cruelty toward me, saying if she'd known the truth, everything would have been different. I told her she couldn't have known, that none of us could have known. Claire's relationship with Monica was shattered. Monica had to face that her lies hadn't just affected her marriage, they'd affected Claire's entire understanding of herself. Claire felt betrayed by the woman she'd thought was her biological mother, the woman who'd used her as a tool to save a failing marriage. For me, the strangest part was accepting that I was a mother. For 25 years, I'd thought of myself as childless, as someone who'd wanted children but never had them. Now I had to reconcile that with the reality that I had a daughter, that I'd given birth, that somewhere in my buried memories was the experience of being pregnant and delivering a baby. Some of those memories have started to surface, triggered by learning the truth. Fragments of being at my aunt's house, feelings of despair and fear, the sense of something happening to my body that I couldn't control or understand. The memories are painful and incomplete, but they're there. Claire and I are building a relationship now, one based on biological truth but also on choice. She's my daughter, yes, but she's also an adult woman with her own life and identity. We're figuring out what it means to be mother and daughter when you meet as adults, when you've missed all the formative years, when you have to build love rather than assuming it exists. Richard and I are still married, still together. The revelation of our biological connection through Claire brought up complicated feelings. We're not blood-related ourselves, but we share a daughter, which creates a bond we never knew existed. We've had to redefine our marriage in light of this new understanding of our connected histories. The DNA test that Claire demanded to settle things did settle them, just not in any way she'd imagined. She'd wanted proof that I wasn't really family, that biology proved her right to exclude me. Instead, she got proof that I was more her family than anyone, that the woman she'd rejected for years was the one who'd actually given her life. It's been 8 months since we learned the truth. Claire now calls me Loretta, though occasionally she'll test out Mom in private moments when she's feeling brave enough to try on the word. She and Richard are slowly repairing their relationship, learning to see each other as both father-daughter and uncle-niece in a complicated layering of biological and social relationships. As for me, I'm learning to be a mother to a 25-year-old daughter I didn't raise. I'm learning to accept that I had a child at 16, that my parents made choices for me when I was too traumatized to make them myself, that I lost decades with my daughter because of decisions made to protect me. I'm also learning that family is even more complicated than I thought. Claire insisted on that DNA test because she wanted to prove that family was about blood, about biology, about genetic connections. She wanted to use science to exclude me from her family. Instead, science proved that family is far more complex than simple biological relationships. Claire is my biological daughter, but she's also Richard's biological niece through a different line. She's the adopted daughter of a woman who lied to everyone. She's the child of a teenage pregnancy that was hidden and forgotten. Blood doesn't tell the whole story. Love doesn't tell the whole story. Choice doesn't tell the whole story. Family is all of these things woven together in patterns more complex than any DNA test can capture. The DNA test that was supposed to settle things actually unsettled everything we thought we knew. And in the process, it gave me back a daughter I never knew I'd lost, and helped Claire understand that the family she'd been rejecting was more truly hers than she'd ever imagined. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more true stories about family secrets, unexpected revelations, and the complicated truth about what makes a family. Have you ever discovered something about your family history that completely changed your understanding of who you are? Have you taken a DNA test that revealed unexpected connections, or learned that your parents kept life-changing secrets from you for your own good? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories matter, And this community is here to support each other through the shock of discovering that everything you believed about your family might not be the whole truth. Remember, DNA tests can reveal more than you bargained for: biological connections you never knew about, family secrets that were carefully buried, truths that change everything. And if you're considering demanding a DNA test to prove a point, remember that you might get answers you weren't prepared for. Sometimes the truth is more complicated than we ever imagined, and sometimes the family we reject turns out to be more connected to us than we knew. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.